The morning sunlight streamed gently through the large bedroom windows, playing off the mirror and lighting every corner of the room. I stood in front of my reflection, slipping into a sleek black dress. It hugged my slender waist, long legs, and smooth curves. My skin, with its soft golden undertone, looked velvety. Smiling at my reflection, I ran a hand through my hair, gathering it into a neat bun. My life seemed flawless. Henry, my husband, was a successful lawyer and a model partner. He always took care of me, remembered important dates, chose thoughtful gifts, and found time to ask about my day. We lived in a beautiful house in Chicago, attended charity events, and most of our friends considered us the perfect couple. But Henry and I were different. He loved order, stability, and precise planning. His life was scheduled to the minute with no room for improvisation. I, on the other hand, craved spontaneity and adrenaline, things he considered unnecessary. "I was thinking we should host a family dinner next week," he said, stepping into the bedroom to grab his briefcase. "It's been a while since we've all gotten together." "Great idea," I replied, smiling. Henry looked at me warmly, as he always did. He was a man who didn't just care. He truly believed that life should be orderly and predictable. When the door closed behind him, I picked up my phone and texted my friends. Tonight, I needed a different rhythm, something to make me forget about plans, rules, and perfection. Later that evening, with Henry asleep in his study, I finished getting ready. High heels, light makeup, bold lipstick. Looking at myself in the mirror, I felt that spark I had been missing. Leaving the house behind, I headed to the club, where lights, music, and freedom awaited me. The music was so loud it felt like it was coursing through my veins. I stepped into the club where the interplay of light and shadow, the sense of perfume and humid air, created an atmosphere of endless celebration. My friends were already at the bar, laughing and chatting away. The crowd moved in sync with the beat, blending into a mesmerizing chaos. I felt free, as if I had shed all the constraints and limitations of my everyday life. This night was mine, just mine. One cocktail, then another, and the tension of the past week seemed to melt away. As I ascended to the club's upper level, where the music was even more electrifying, I saw him, a stranger, tall, confident, with an intense gaze that lingered on me just a moment too long. He stood near the dance floor, calmly observing the crowd, but there was a magnetic energy about him that seemed to pull me in. I didn't know who he was, but his gaze made my steps falter. I quickly looked away and walked on, trying not to focus on him, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his presence. A few minutes later, I sensed him approach. "First time here?" His voice was deep with a slight rasp. I turned to him, trying to keep my composure. We exchanged a few words, nothing significant, yet every sentence was laced with an unspoken tension. I smiled, playing the part of a confident, carefree woman I wanted to be tonight. His hand brushed mine lightly as he suggested we go somewhere quieter. For some reason, I didn't say no. We ended up in a small, dimly lit corner of the club, where the music was softer and the lights played gentle shadows. He looked at me as if he'd known me his whole life. The kiss was unexpected. I didn't even realize who made the first move, but it was long, deep, and frighteningly real. My heart raced as though it might burst from my chest. Realizing what I'd just done, I pulled away. "I need to go," I said, trying to sound composed, though my voice trembled. I slipped out of the club, never learning his name, and spent the entire drive home convincing myself it was a one-time mistake. At home, looking at a sleeping Henry, I repeated to myself that no one would ever know. A week had passed since that night at the club, but the memory of the kiss wouldn't leave me alone. Every morning I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself it was just a fleeting mistake. But the guilt lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Henry had announced that dinner would start at 7, asking me to help with the preparations. I focused on setting the table and preparing the food, hiding my inner turmoil. This was the first family dinner in a long time, and Henry wanted everything to be perfect. As the guests started arriving, I smiled, greeting each one warmly. Conversations, laughter, the familiar ritual of family gatherings. Everything felt normal until he walked in. Alex. My gaze froze on the tall figure of the young man entering the room with his parents. His confident posture, slightly messy dark hair, and unmistakable gaze made my heart stop. It was him, the stranger from the club. Alex looked at me and recognition flickered in his eyes, but he gave nothing away. He continued greeting relatives as if I were just another face at the table. I tried to keep my composure, but panic surged through me. What if he said something to Henry? What if he dropped a hint? At dinner, Alex sat across from me. His gaze occasionally lingered on my face, and his smirk carried an edge of mischief. He seemed far too at ease. "So, Emma, how do you like Chicago?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "We've been here for years, Alex," I replied curtly, avoiding his eyes. "It shows. You've really settled into this life," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. His questions and jokes seemed harmless, but I felt the undercurrent. He was enjoying my discomfort. Henry, absorbed in a conversation with his brother, didn't notice at first as I started nervously fiddling with my fork. Only near the end of dinner did he turn to me. "Are you okay? You look a little tired," he asked. "I'm fine, just a bit overworked," I said, trying to sound natural. But I was far from calm. I knew this was only the beginning. Alex's silent smirk made it clear he hadn't forgotten a thing. After dinner, the guests moved to the living room, and I began clearing the table, hoping the task would distract me from the whirlwind of emotions that had been building all evening. Henry and his brother were deep in conversation, their voices drifting from the other room. I carefully stacked plates, trying to ignore the growing tension inside me. Alex appeared without warning. He grabbed a stack of plates as if to help, but his intent was unmistakable. His presence immediately unsettled me. The narrow hallway between the kitchen and living room suddenly felt stifling. He placed the plates down on a nearby shelf, stepping closer. His gaze was too direct, too bold. I tried to turn away, but his presence was magnetic, pulling me back. Every movement, every glance carried an unspoken purpose that made escape feel impossible. The silence between us was deafening. Alex didn't look away, and I was desperately searching for an excuse to leave. But then his hand brushed against mine, and I froze, as if that small contact had paralyzed my will to move. Before I could react, he leaned in. His lips met mine, and for a moment I resisted. But the struggle within me crumbled, giving way to something much stronger. The kiss was fiery, daring, awakening feelings I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed impossible for anyone nearby not to hear. Footsteps in the hallway shattered the moment. Henry was approaching. I pulled away abruptly, feeling heat rush to my face. Alex, on the other hand, seemed completely unfazed. He picked up the plates and walked away as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen in the hallway, struggling to regain my composure. My thoughts were a chaotic storm. I knew I had crossed a dangerous line, and there was no easy way back. The next day, Henry gathered the family for another dinner. It was his way of strengthening bonds and showing how important traditions were. I tried to appear composed, but thoughts of what had happened with Alex the night before wouldn't leave my mind. Everything started calmly. Guests slowly took their seats, chatting about plans and sharing stories. Alex, as always, seemed perfectly at ease. He sat next to me, and I felt a wave of tension the moment he was within arm's reach. I focused on a conversation with Henry's aunt, but a sudden touch under the table made me flinch. Alex's hand slid gently along my leg, and I nearly dropped my fork. His movement was smooth, confident, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Trying not to betray my emotions, I kept listening to the conversation, but my mind was in turmoil. His fingers rested on my knee, then, as if testing my limits, started moving higher. I took a deep breath, struggling to maintain my composure, but my hand involuntarily gripped the tablecloth. Alex didn't look at me. His face remained calm, and no one at the table could suspect what was happening. "So, Emma, how do you like Alex?" Henry's voice broke through my thoughts. I forced a nervous smile, feeling the heat rise to my face. "He's an interesting young man," I managed, trying to sound natural. Alex turned his head slightly, and a hint of sarcasm flickered in his eyes. He said nothing, but his gaze spoke volumes. I lowered my eyes to my plate, trying to conceal the storm inside. Every gesture he made awakened feelings I hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a mix of fear and excitement that I couldn't shake. The entire evening I avoided looking at Alex. His hand had left my leg, but the sensation of his touch lingered, like an invisible thread that only tightened between us. During dinner, Henry unexpectedly proposed a family trip to a mountain cabin. He spoke enthusiastically, describing how it would be a perfect escape from the city's hustle. His plan sounded ideal: nature walks, evenings by the fireplace, games, and conversations. Everyone eagerly supported the idea, but I felt a chill run down my spine. Alex would be there too. The very thought made me uneasy, but I forced a smile and nodded along with the others. A few days later, on an early Saturday morning, we packed up the car and set off. I sat beside Henry, pretending to listen to his story about some work matter, though his words barely registered. Alex sat silently in the back seat, his quiet presence more unsettling than any conversation. At a gas station stop, Alex found a moment to get closer. His tone was almost playful, but there was an unmistakable confidence in his words. "Looking forward to the trip?" he asked, leaning in just a bit closer than necessary. "Alex, stop," I whispered, trying to sound firm, though I knew how unconvincing it came out. He smirked, adjusting the strap on his backpack, and returned to the car. My face burned with heat as I climbed back into my seat. The cabin was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. High ceilings, a cozy fireplace, enormous windows overlooking the forest. Henry was thrilled, immediately organizing everything, assigning rooms, planning where we'd gather in the evenings. The first night passed surprisingly uneventfully. We sat by the fireplace chatting about plans for the next day, then everyone retreated to their rooms. Henry fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't quiet my restless thoughts. Replaying moments from dinner, the drive, and each fleeting glance from Alex, I realized with a pang that I wanted to see him again. My heart raced. I knew this was a dangerous game, but something deep inside refused to acknowledge it. Morning in the mountain cabin began with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the crackle of firewood in the hearth. Henry, as usual, took charge of the day, discussing plans with his usual enthusiasm. Everyone gathered for breakfast, exchanging casual remarks about the weather and the day ahead. "We'll start with a hike," Henry announced, slicing toast onto plates. "Then tonight we'll gather in the gazebo, enjoy some wine by the fire. And of course, the hot tub's on the terrace. Perfect way to end the day." Everyone nodded approvingly, but my thoughts wandered. Alex sat across from me, his gaze distant, but I felt a tension that made it impossible to focus. His apparent indifference only heightened my awareness of him. Breakfast passed quietly, but the unspoken tension lingered. Each of Alex's movements, a sip of coffee, the casual touch of his hand on the table, seemed laden with meaning. By midday, we set off on the hike. Henry confidently led the group along the trail, enthusiastically describing the scenery. I stayed toward the back, trying not to draw attention to myself. Alex kept his distance, but our eyes met more often than coincidence could explain. At a steep incline, my foot slipped on the rocks. Alex was instantly at my side, gripping my hand firmly to steady me. "Careful," he murmured, his voice barely audible to anyone else. "Thank you," I replied, avoiding his gaze. Henry, busy photographing the scenery, paid no attention. We continued walking, but focusing on the beauty of the trail became increasingly difficult. By evening, we returned to the cabin. Henry and his brother busied themselves with dinner preparations while I went to change. The brief solitude helped me regain a semblance of composure, but stepping into the living room brought back the tension immediately. We gathered in the gazebo around a large fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across faces, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. Alex sat directly across from me, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before looking away. Conversations flowed easily, filled with laughter and lighthearted plans for the coming days. But each time Alex directed a question at me, his tone held something deeper. To everyone else, his words seemed innocent, but I understood their true meaning. "What do you like most about trips like this?" he asked. "The silence," I replied, keeping my eyes on the fire. "It's always the loudest, isn't it?" he remarked. I almost dropped my glass. His words were simple, but their undertone resonated within me. I turned my gaze back to the fire, focusing on its dance to ground myself against the rising tension. The night ended with a soak in the hot tubs on the terrace. The warm water and crisp air created a contrast that relaxed the body but sharpened the mind. Most of the others had gone inside, but I lingered, savoring the quiet. Alex approached quietly, slipping into the neighboring tub without a word. For a while, we sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest. "In moments like these, it feels like the world stops," he said suddenly. "Maybe that's what makes them so valuable," I replied, surprised by my own honesty. The conversation unfolded naturally but stayed within the bounds of propriety. We spoke about life, dreams, and what makes people truly happy. His words were calm, yet each carried a personal weight that felt impossible to ignore. When I returned to the cabin, wrapped in a warm robe, I realized this moment had meant more to me than I was willing to admit. The morning was quiet. Henry and his brother left for the city to buy groceries, leaving the house to me and Alex. The temporary solitude seemed insignificant, yet every detail made it feel otherwise. The silence, broken only by the crackling fire in the hearth, heightened my tension rather than easing it. I began setting the table for dinner when Alex entered the kitchen. His calm stride and easy smile exuded a nonchalance that I couldn't replicate. "Need any help?" he asked, grabbing a stack of napkins and placing them on the table. I nodded, focusing on my tasks. We worked in silence, but every movement, every gesture felt charged. I could sense his gaze on me, though I avoided meeting his eyes. When his fingers brushed mine as he handed me a fork, the touch lingered just a fraction too long. My heart skipped a beat and I quickly pulled my hand away, pretending nothing had happened. "You're trying so hard to act like you don't feel anything," he said, his voice soft but laced with challenge. His words caught me off guard. I froze, staring at him. Alex stood too close, his presence overwhelming. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, turning quickly and heading for the door. "Of course you do," he said calmly, his voice reaching me before I could leave the room. I needed to get away. I went upstairs seeking refuge in the bedroom. Standing by the window, I gazed at the snow-covered peaks. The cold glass soothed my heated palms, but my thoughts continued to swirl. Minutes later, I heard footsteps. Alex entered the room without knocking, his movements deliberate yet unhurried, as if giving me time to react. "Do you always try to be honest with yourself?" he asked. I remained silent, feeling his presence draw nearer. His voice was steady, but there was something in it that sent a shiver through me. "Sometimes it's too hard," I finally admitted. Alex stood behind me. His breath was barely perceptible, but I could feel its warmth. My shoulders tensed as his hands lightly touched them. His touch wasn't rough, but carried a quiet confidence. "You're afraid of this moment," he murmured, so close I could hear each inhale. I wanted to protest, but the words caught in my throat. When he turned me to face him, I looked into his eyes, and the world around us seemed to fade away. His fingers brushed gently against my cheek, trailing down to my neck. He pulled me closer, his lips meeting mine softly at first, as if waiting for my response. The kiss deepened, growing more insistent, unleashing a surge of passion I hadn't felt in years. My hands instinctively reached for his shoulders, but in that instant I realized I was crossing the very line I had feared. "This is your last Christmas gift," I whispered, my words sounding like an excuse more to myself than to him. "Enjoy it." Alex didn't hesitate. His hands trailed down my back, finding the zipper of my skirt. With a smooth motion, the fabric slid to the floor, baring my hips. His lips moved to my neck, planting soft kisses that sent ripples of heat through my body. I leaned against the edge of the table as his fingers traveled upward over my skin. His movements were deliberate, confident yet never rough. Each gesture, every moment felt calculated, as if he could sense my every thought. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment. For those few fleeting seconds, all my worries, fears, and doubts vanished, leaving only the raw intensity of what was happening. The house was silent when Liam arrived earlier than expected. He wanted to rest before dinner, assuming he had the place to himself. The quiet seemed ordinary at first, disturbed only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. But as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, A half-open bedroom door caught his attention. He hesitated, noticing movement through the narrow gap. Stepping closer, he froze. Through the small opening, he saw Alex and me. We stood near the window, far too close. Alex's hands rested on my waist, sliding down my back, while his lips brushed against my neck. My fingers clutched the windowsill, and my eyes were closed as I leaned into him. Liam was paralyzed, disbelief flooding through him. The scene before him was unmistakable. Not wanting to be seen, he backed away, his steps careful and silent, before rushing down the stairs and out of the house. Sitting in his car, Liam tried to calm his racing thoughts. What he had witnessed was undeniable, but the question of how to tell Henry gnawed at him. When Henry arrived moments later, Liam stepped out to meet him. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost," Henry remarked, noticing Liam's pale face. Liam hesitated, his throat dry, but the truth burst out. "Henry, I don't know how to say this, but I saw Emma and Alex. They were together." "What are you talking about?" Henry's brows furrowed, his expression shifting to one of concern. "They were in the bedroom. I saw them by the window. They were kissing," Liam said, his voice breaking. Henry stood frozen, processing the words. Then his face flushed with anger. "Are you sure?" His voice was low and dangerous. "Yes," Liam replied firmly. Without waiting, Henry stormed into the house, his footsteps thunderous against the wooden stairs. Liam followed but didn't try to stop him. When Henry entered the bedroom, he found exactly what Liam had described. Alex stood close to me, his hands gripping my waist, while our lips met in a kiss that left no room for doubt. "What the hell is going on?" Henry's voice erupted, shaking the room. I gasped, pulling away from Alex and stumbling back, my face pale. Alex turned to face Henry but didn't step back. "You betrayed me! In my house with my wife?" Henry roared, grabbing Alex by the collar. "Henry, stop!" I cried, tears streaming down my face. Alex tried to speak, but Henry's rage consumed him. "It's not what you think," Alex started, but Henry shoved him hard onto the bed. "Not what I think. I saw it with my own eyes." I cowered in the corner, my body shaking, tears blurring my vision. Everything I had fought to hide was now exposed, my life unraveling before me. "You've destroyed everything," Henry said coldly, turning to me. His voice was quiet, but more devastating than any shout. I couldn't answer. My world had shattered, and there was no going back. After Alex left, the house sank into an oppressive silence. Henry stood by the window, his back to me, his shoulders tense with each heavy breath. I sat at the edge of the bed, not daring to speak. His silence was louder than any words. He turned abruptly, his eyes cold, his face a mask of disappointment and pain. I wanted to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. Every attempt to speak felt useless, hollow. Without a word, Henry walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. His exit was deliberate, a declaration of finality. I knew this was the end. Sometime later, he returned. In his hands was a suitcase, my suitcase. Henry placed it by the door, and the weight of his decision was undeniable. "Go to your parents." His voice was calm, almost mechanical, each word heavy with intent. I nodded, feeling my heart clench with pain. The night stretched endlessly. I stayed alone in the bedroom, surrounded by things that only yesterday felt like pieces of my life. Sitting on the bed, I stared out the window, where the moonlight reflected on the snow. Everything that had happened in recent days replayed in my mind, like ghosts resurrected to haunt me. I thought about how it all began, the innocent glances, the fleeting touches. I tried to pinpoint the moment I lost control, but no answer came. Each step, every choice led to this moment that had now destroyed everything. To Henry, I was no longer his wife. To him, I had become a stranger, a betrayer. I had lost not only his trust, but also my place in the family, my job, everything that defined my life. By dawn, I packed my things. The suitcase stood by the door, ready for my departure tomorrow. I knew I was leaving this house forever. My reflection in the mirror was unrecognizable. A face hollowed by exhaustion, eyes red from crying. I was no longer the woman who once believed her life was perfect. Everything felt colorless and empty. I had returned to my parents' house, but it didn't bring me peace. The room where I had grown up felt foreign, as if it was filled not with my memories but only with silence and pain. Alex had called several times, but I didn't answer. His messages went unread, though each one made my heart ache. He wrote that he wanted to talk, to explain, to find a solution, but I knew there was nothing I could say to him. Each time my phone vibrated, the weight on my chest grew heavier. The thought that our connection had destroyed everything consumed me. Our meetings, moments of weakness, now seemed like nothing more than a series of mistakes leading to disaster. My mother tried to support me, but her questions about what had happened went unanswered. I couldn't look her in the eye, couldn't explain how I had let this happen. Meanwhile, things at Henry's house had also changed. Liam tried to speak with him, to convince him to hear me out, to at least understand my perspective. "Henry, are you sure this is the only solution?" His voice was gentle but tinged with regret. "Yes, I'm sure," Henry replied firmly, without looking at his brother. "Everything is already decided." Liam sighed heavily but didn't press further. Henry was resolute. His decisions had always been final, but now they carried not just firmness but also pain. I spent my days in a fog of sadness, trying to figure out what to do next. My family was broken. My place beside Henry no longer existed. I felt myself slowly sinking into the depths of depression with no visible way out. At night, I woke up from nightmares where I saw Henry over and over again. His gaze, filled with disappointment, haunted me. I saw him walking away, leaving me alone, and I knew it wasn't just a dream but the reality I had created for myself. The apartment in Chicago was small but cozy. It had nothing extra: a tiny kitchen, a cramped bedroom, and a window overlooking a gray street. It was nothing like the home I had shared with Henry, but I had to adjust. After moving in, I spent the first few days in complete solitude. Boxes of my belongings remained unpacked as I sat by the window, watching strangers pass by on the street below. Their faces seemed full of life, a life I felt I no longer had. I had lost not only Henry, but also my job. He had insisted that I leave the company. It was logical, but that didn't make it any easier. Losing my job was the final confirmation that I was no longer part of his life. Alex sent messages, but I didn't reply. He tried to apologize, asked how I was coping, and suggested we talk. Each time my phone buzzed, I turned away. I knew nothing good would come from talking to him. We were both part of a mistake that couldn't be undone. My days blurred into a monotonous cycle: morning coffee, a short walk, shopping at the nearest store, then retreating to my solitude. It was oppressive, yet in some way this state allowed me to reflect. Sometimes I replayed everything that had happened. Where was the moment I could have stopped? Was it that night at the club? Or when Alex first stood too close? But the memories brought neither answers nor relief. One evening I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was gaunt, my eyes tired. This wasn't me. This was a woman who had lost everything but wasn't yet ready to admit there could be something ahead. I decided I had to start over. Slowly, painfully, but I had to let go of the past. Loneliness, as much as it hurt, had now become my new reality. Each day I realized more and more. All I had left was myself. Several weeks had passed. Days blended together in monotony, and I slowly learned to live in the silence I had created for myself. This apartment held no traces of the past, only bare walls and my thoughts, which refused to leave me alone. When I heard the knock at the door, my heart skipped a beat. Opening it, I saw Alex. His expression was serious, and his presence filled the room with an unspoken tension. He stepped inside, glancing around as if trying to understand how I lived now. The space was sparse and cold, much like the last few weeks of my life. We sat at the small table, the silence between us saying everything words couldn't. Alex looked different. The confidence that once defined him had been replaced with something more human, almost vulnerable. His eyes searched mine as though hoping to find an answer I wasn't ready to give. I knew why he had come. His presence brought back memories I had been trying to suppress. Everything that had happened between us now felt not just like a mistake, but a lesson I had paid too high a price to learn. I struggled to find the right words to explain. My heart still carried his image, but this connection no longer brought warmth or joy. It had become a weight I couldn't allow myself to carry any longer. As I looked at him, I felt the collision of past and present. Our decisions had destroyed everything I valued. We were both to blame, but the consequences were ours to face separately. Alex remained silent. His gaze held understanding, but he didn't try to convince me otherwise. He stood as though accepting the unspoken words between us. Before leaving, he looked at me one last time, a mix of regret and acknowledgement in his eyes. When the door closed behind him, I felt hollow. This was the end, final and inevitable. But alongside the pain came a faint sense of hope. Perhaps I could begin again. The divorce papers lay on the table. Henry had come in person to hand them over, his face expressionless. I stared at the documents, unable to open them right away. Everything felt so final, as though this moment was meant to draw a line through my life. "Good luck, Emma," he said, his voice flat, almost indifferent. I nodded, unable to find any words in response. His eyes held no anger or pain, only a cold detachment. He turned and walked away, leaving me at the doorway with the papers that severed the last ties between us. When the door clicked shut, I sank into a chair, feeling an odd emptiness. The divorce had been inevitable, but now that it was real, I felt something inside me finally break. I didn't open the documents immediately. Instead, I went to the box of photos I hadn't unpacked since moving in. Picking up one of the old snapshots, I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. In the picture, Henry and I stood on a beach. His arm was around my waist, and my smile was genuine and carefree. I tried to recall that moment, but the memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Tears welled in my eyes, but I held them back. Placing the photo back in the box, I closed it firmly, deciding that the past should stay where it belonged. Night fell as I sat by the window. The city sparkled with lights, a sight both beautiful and hollow. I poured myself a glass of wine, allowing myself to relax for the first time in a long while. As I gazed at the stars and the shimmering streets below, I realized that despite everything, I was still here. I had lost my family, my home, my job, but I still had the chance to begin again. A small smile crept onto my lips, tentative at first, then a bit stronger. The pain hadn't disappeared, but with it came the faintest glimmer of hope. The future was uncertain, but it no longer frightened me. This chapter seemed to have ended, but deep inside I felt there was still more to be written.